Basically, they're rather than buying like 1 foot sections of cable all the time, like the things, in order to decrease the capacitance of your cable, if you can use shorter or longer cable. So basically, you can buy like these cable kits that basically come with raw cable, and you can buy these solderless ends that basically you just shove the cable in, tighten the screw, and then cut it to the length that you need, and you can do it that way. So these are really cool. It's probably what I'm going to do eventually, once I sort of get a little more situated on my board staying the same for a little bit. The only real downside to these I've found is that when you're like me, who's constantly switching out pedals and tugging on them and stuff, it's not as secure a connection as soldering them. So that sort of brings me back to DIY. Buy bulk cable and bulk connectors and learn how to solder them yourself. It's not hard. The reason people think soldering is so hard sometimes is because they're using the worst soldering gun on the freaking planet. If it doesn't get hot enough, it's not going to adhere to the metal with the solder. So go to wherever, spend maybe more than $5 on a soldering iron, and usually you can get really good results. But yeah, any more things? I think I've covered everything that I wanted to talk about tonight. Choosing your amps is another sort of thing that people sort of get caught up on. They're like, oh, I bought this super high gain distortion pedal. Why does it sound like shit? There's a reason high gain amps a lot of times are huge. Like you look at like hot rodded Marshalls and Miss Boogies and stuff, they're huge amps. They're usually a head in a 412 combo or a 412 cab. That's because there's more to heavy sounding music or whatever than just the amount of distortion that you have. So when I get kids who are like, well, why does it when I plug into this my little tiny practice amp, it doesn't sound like a wall of half stacks? It's like, well, the same sort of rules apply. It's just basically you need to push more air, please. So when I use pedals, usually I'm using at least a 100 watt head and a 212 or a 412. But I mean, that's a personal preference thing. You do whatever makes it sound good, you know? So yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I'm tired of talking now. But I hope you guys learned something. You know, I talked fast.
Did you talk about attenuating at all?
Attenuating?
Is that something you got into earlier?
Not a huge fan.
No?
No, attenuating is really cool if you're taking an attenuator. And an attenuator, if you guys don't know, basically a lot of amps will have master volumes, so you can take the overall volume of the amp down. But you're not working the power tube section of the amp as hard as you can, so you sort of lose a little bit of that power tube saturation that you get for when you're cranking it really loud. So attenuators are basically designed to go after the amp and bring down the overall volume that way, so the tubes are still working as hard as they can. Attenuators work really well when you're going from my brain hurts to I can live with this. But when you're going from my brain hurts to my parents are upstairs and I don't want to piss them off, that's when they start to suck real bad. Because actually, the reason they do that isn't necessarily because the attenuator sucks. It's because there's actually like there's a natural effect that your ears have called, I think it's called the Fletcher-Munson curve. Basically, like at louder volumes, your ears sort of perceive sound differently. And so when it comes to guitar amplifiers, usually they sound better when your ears are sort of bottomed out a little bit. So you do lose a little bit of that, but usually using attenuators to take it from my main amp is a Carbon Legacy, which is a 100 watt 6 EL34 amp, and when it's fully wound up, it literally makes my stomach, like, you can feel like the water in your stomach sort of going, it hurts my stomach to be in front of that amp being so loud. So I would use my attenuator before when I had one to bring it down to a non-stomach curdling level. But in that case, they work really well. Did that answer your question, Taylor?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, they work good if you're cutting in, usually about halfway, like volume halving the volume's good, but when you go farther than that, usually you're started.
I think that, I guess that's where it would work for me too.
Yeah.
That's why I asked. So.
Yeah, the best attenuator is the proper amp for the job though.
Fair enough.
But usually, if you're using your Road King, for example, there's no other amp on the planet that sounds like a Road King. So yeah, in your case, an attenuator would be beneficial, for sure. Yeah.
How about any effects loop stuff? Did you get into that?
I didn't. Effects loops, like I said, preamp, power amp, sandwiched in the middle. There's two types of effects loops that you can really get. There's a serial effects loop, which is basically literally a plug in the back of your amp that goes send and return, and it's when you connect the cable together, literally your amp is going through the cable in that. A parallel effects loop is basically two lines side by side, and you're plugging into this line, and there's a level control that controls how much of this line is in the next line, in your main line. So you can basically use it as a sort of a mix control for the amount of signal that's coming in that your effects loop has. So turning it all the way up, you're going through, your whole signal is going through the effects loop and in through whatever pedals that you have in the chain. If you have it all the way off, there's nothing going through the signal. So I'm not a huge fan of effects loops for a couple reasons. One, it basically doubles the amount of cables that I have going from my amp to my guitar. So it basically increases the chances of someone stepping on and breaking a cable. And it also increases the capacitance in my signal because I'm adding like 40 plus feet of cable going to my pedal board again. So a lot of times that is where I find a buffer is like absolutely essential. Whether it be a buffered pedal like the El Capistan, or actually you can actually get like little boosters that have a buffer built into them as well. That's when I find buffers are essential.
And your show clone's good at the end of the chain too for that.
Yeah. The cool thing about using a booster that has a buffer built into it is you can actually use it as like a solo boost as well, because you have a boost in the effects loop and you go, so that's a really good way to go. That's a good way to go. But I mean, other than that, effects loops can suck your tone a little bit in terms of having an amount of cable. Some amps, and I know this problem isn't as prevalent now, especially with your Road King, you wouldn't have this problem. Some effects loops just blow. For some reason, they just have a sucky, like electronic. I can't really think of the word. Like this effects loop circuit just sucks. It doesn't really go fully wet, it's called, like a mix. The parallel effects loops have a mix control. Some of them don't go fully wet, so it's sort of a bit of annoyance. But you just sort of have to play with it. Pedals I would put in my effects loop are basically reverbs and delays, and that's about it. Like I said, I'm not a fan of putting modulation effects into the effects loop because a lot of the times they'll either have a volume decrease or an increase. And because it's not really a factor that the designer really puts into play, it doesn't have a level control, so you can't decrease or increase that sort of thing. Plus I find the cheese factor of using pedals in the effects loop and after distortion, like modulation pedals, is like increased tenfold. Because if you think back to the 80s was all effects loops and rack systems and choruses in the effects loop, so it was like, I just think of like 80s Rush is what I think of. Choruses in the effects loop. I just find it sounds more natural in front of the amp, in front of the distortion. I shouldn't say in front of the amp, in front of distortion, basically. It sounds more natural because there's not a big jump in the difference in sounds because it's not as prevalent. Basically, I'm a big fan, and this is sort of a thing that I've sort of developed with people who aren't guitar players. It's like when you kick on a pedal, and they're like, "Why the fuck was that pedal so loud?" I'm like, I'm sorry. So I'm aware of like other people's perception of pedals, and a lot of guys who use pedal boards get a bad name from when there's a big jump between tones, like jump between levels, like how the different pedals have different levels and you don't equalize them, so when you press them it's the same volume. Or just simply using pedals and using different pedals for different like choruses and verses, so your sound is basically never the same twice. So that's why I like to use pedals as like a bass, and then put pedals on top of it, because you always have that bass, that normal tone that's always there, so that you're either adding or subtracting to that tone that's always there, so people don't freak out when it's like, oh, turn on a different distortion pedal for that song. Aha. So, I mean, just sort of make it work for yourself, but that's sort of my thing. I like to have everything sounding similar, but different, you know? Similar but different. But I'm a big proponent of keeping the levels the same. All of everything after my distortion on my pedal board has a level control, and I specifically bought those pedals with that in mind. Like the tremolo is a huge one. Because you're using tremolo and it's decreasing the volume like that, usually there's like a perceived volume decrease because you're actually limiting the signal. So having a volume control on a tremolo is pretty much essential. Same with reverb. With reverb, I find that when you increase the reverb, you sort of drown out the sound a little bit, so increasing the volume is really handy for sort of sticking out a little bit. But yeah, and the delay, I believe, has volume control as well. But yeah. Any more questions, Dan?
Do you usually EQ with the amp, or do you usually get another EQ pedal or something like
I'm
that?
not really a big fan of EQ pedals either.
Yeah.
I usually like to, I sort of went into talking about why I don't like noise gates. Because they're sort of, I still can't think of that saying. It's because it's like using a noise gate is like eliminating the problem rather than fixing the problem. Like it's blanketing the problem. See, I can't think of the term. But it's not fixing the problem, it's just making the big problem invisible. So it's always there still. So relying on that pedal to fix everything isn't necessarily the best thing. So usually with noise gates, I look into why that hum is there and try to eliminate it before I squash it with a noise gate. Because noise gates, no matter how many companies that make noise gates and be like, they're transparent, you can't tell the difference. A lot of times it's not really true. With EQ pedals, it's the same sort of thing. I mean, I like to use EQ pedals for like a boost for a solo or something like that. Like put a little bit of a mid-range boost in the EQ and then you stick out of the mix a little bit more for a solo. That's really cool. But fixing an overall problem, I'd rather do it from the amp or getting a different pedal or changing the pedal setting as well. But it's definitely a combination of the two. So, yeah. EQs are good for certain things. Some stuff it's not that great for, but it depends on sort of what you think. I'm by no means against using them, but I have valuable pedal board real estate that I need to take care of first.
Makes sense.
But yeah, I think we're done. Are we good?
I think we're good.
Yeah. I mean, boutique pedals wise, I mean, I brought all those pedals out for you guys to sort of look at, but it looks like we ran out of time. But like they're all ours, I think. Well, some of them are going to go. But companies to look at for buying pedals is really cool because, like I sort of hinted at before, there are a ton of Canadian pedals, like Canadian made. Honest to God.
And fantastic.
Dr. Scientist is one of them. He's out of Calgary. He does tremolo. He does dirt. He does probably like the reverb that I use is probably his most famous creation. Sort of all the nerds, pedal nerds, really love him. Mainly because, and this is sort of a boutique thing as well. They have these guys. This is what they do. Like they live and breathe pedals. So they have really good customer service. They're super nice guys. Usually they'll answer directly to you if you have a problem. Another Canadian company is Empress and Diamond. These guys are like the, hey, we're super expensive and we do lots of stuff. Like this is a delay pedal that's $465. So admittedly I pooped my pants a little bit when I found out how much they are. But like I said, they're not afraid to put out something like this. I mean, who on earth buys $465 pedals? Well, they found out. Actually, a lot of them. But a company like Boss would never, ever take a chance on taking something like this and making it a reality. But this is now that these have come out, these are the only guys that do the amount of features that this thing has. So, I mean, it's sort of like, yeah, it's expensive, but it's completely a unique product. It's made in Canada, and that's really cool. I mean, there's not a lot of industries in Canada anymore that we can actually buy Canadian. I mean, there's Godin guitars, I mean, I don't know if any cars are made in Canada anymore. Are they? I don't think so.
I think an electric one, but you're not allowed to drive it in Canada.
It's always nice to support Canadian builders. There's actually quite a few Canadian amp companies too. Mostly like, I think Wizard is Canadian. Just Titan, a lot of high gain amps coming from Canada. But it's nice to support Canadian guys. And they're all like the friendliest guys on the planet. So it's like when I went down to NAMM, which is like the big trade show for guitar stuff and music stuff. It's just a blast because they're all like the coolest guys to talk to. So when you can, buy Canadian. When you can't buy Canadian, buy boutique. Those are just fun to say. And actually, they have higher resale value too, which I know is the most unrock and roll thing I could ever possibly say. And I do not consider it when I buy stuff. But it's nice to be able to sell close to what you paid for it if you decide that pedal's not for you. So yeah, that's my spiel on boutique stuff. And usually they have like a lifetime warranty and stuff too, so not that there's much wrong to go with pedals, unless you play my pedal. But yeah, I think I've concluded my stuff. Anything else? Questions? Comments? Concerns?
No.
Awesome. And did you learn a lot?
I learned a lot.
Tired now?
What?
Are you tired?
I don't get tired.
I'm an animal. Yeah, I think I covered everything that I pretty much wanted to talk about. Feel free to gawk at that beautiful Ibanez Destroyer. Beautiful. That was actually a cool sort of story how I got that. I'm a big fan of Ibanez Japanese sort of weird guitars, and I was sort of dug Ibanez. So it's the Paul Gilbert freak that I am. And but I wanted like Strats and stuff, so I bought an Ibanez Strat. It was like the worst guitar ever. It was like it was 73. Because Ibanez, before they were like Ibanez making shredder guitars, they would make copies of Gibsons and Fenders and stuff. And I always thought that was a big kind of cool like middle finger to American guitar companies. So, because they were really well-made guitars, and at the time, the Fender and Gibson that we know today weren't really doing that well. So they sort of, this is where the Japanese sort of market sort of come into play. And that guitar was basically like my dream guitar. I always wanted an Explorer. It didn't say Gibson on it, which is cool, even though I'm not as unpartial to Gibson anymore. But it's the same guitar that Van Halen used on his first album. Like anything that he didn't use whammy bars for, he used that guitar. And we had like a Facebook contest one day, and the guy, one of our customers, posted that guitar on the Facebook page, and it was just like, it's like the most 80s pictures I've ever seen in my life. Like it had like a Porsche calendar on the wall, like an old ficus, and right next to this. And I told him, I was like, man, that is the coolest guitar ever. I've been wanting one of those for a long time. And then he came in and sold it to me for really cheap. So that was a good day.